Every fall, 60 million Americans buy a pot of garden mums. By Thanksgiving, the flowers are brown. By January, the plant is dead. And by April, the pot is in the trash. And in September, they buy another one. Same cycle, same $12, same result. But garden mums are not annuals. They are cold hardy, zone 3 through 9 perennials that can live in your garden for 20 years. The reason yours die every winter comes down to one specific thing you can fix this September. What nobody told you when you picked up that pot of bronze and gold chrysanthemums at the garden center is that the plant itself is perfectly capable of surviving winter. Mums have been growing as perennials in gardens across North America, Europe, and Asia for centuries. They handle deep freezes, heavy snow, and months of dormancy without trouble. The chrysanthemum species is built for cold survival. So if the plant is not the problem and the cold is not the problem, what is killing your mums every single year? The pot. That is the entire answer. A mum sitting in a container on your porch has its root system completely above ground, surrounded by nothing but a thin wall of plastic or ceramic. When air temperatures drop below 20 degrees, that root ball freezes solid. The roots die, the crown dies, and the plant is finished. The same root system, the same variety, the same genetics, planted in the ground at the correct depth, is insulated on all sides by surrounding soil that stays dramatically warmer than the air above. The ground temperature 6 inches down rarely drops past freezing in most zones, even when the air above is well into the negatives. That thermal insulation is the difference between a mum that dies in January and a mum that pushes fresh green growth in April. Every mum you have ever thrown away would likely have survived the winter if it had been taken out of the pot and planted in garden soil before the first hard freeze. That is not a guess. That is how perennial mums work everywhere they are grown, as permanent garden plants, in botanical gardens, in heritage perennial borders, and in millions of home gardens across zones 3 through 9. The same species that dies on your porch every January thrives in the ground for decades. The only variable is whether the roots are above ground in a container or below ground in soil. The plant does not change, the insulation does. So here is the trick, and it is embarrassingly simple once you hear it. The moment you bring a mum home from the garden center in September, take it out of the decorative pot and plant it directly in the ground. In a garden bed, in amended soil, at the correct depth, before the first frost. Not on the porch to enjoy for a few weeks first. Not in the garage when it gets cold. Directly into garden soil while the ground is still warm. Choose a spot that gets at least 6 hours of direct sun. Mums tolerate partial shade, but full sun produces the most compact growth, the most flowers, and the strongest crown heading into winter. Dig a hole about twice the width of the nursery pot and the same depth. Mix a handful of compost into the removed soil if your garden soil is heavy clay or very sandy. Slide the mum out of the pot, loosen any circling roots on the outside of the root ball with your fingers, set the plant in the hole, backfill, and water deeply. The entire planting takes 5 minutes, and that is all there is to it. That is the entire September trick. Everything else in this video supports it, but planting in the ground in September is the single action that separates mums that live for 20 years from mums that live for 6 weeks. Why does the calendar matter so much? Because a mum planted in September has 4 to 6 weeks of warm soil ahead of it. The ground is still holding summer heat, the days are still reasonably long, and the root system has time to push new roots outward into the surrounding garden soil and anchor itself before winter arrives. Those new roots are the lifeline. They connect the plant to the thermal mass of the earth. They draw moisture during fall rains. And they establish the underground network that keeps the crown alive through months of frozen air above. A mum planted in late October or early November faces a completely different situation. The soil is cold, the autumn days are short, the root system has 1 to 2 weeks at best before the ground freezes, and in that narrow window it barely grows at all. The crown sits in shallow, loose soil with almost no root connection to the surrounding earth. The first deep freeze either kills the exposed roots directly or heaves the entire shallow root ball upward out of the ground, leaving the crown sitting on the surface where it freezes and dries out. Same plant, same variety, same garden bed. Different planting date, completely different outcome. September is the window. If you're in zones 3 through 5, aim for the first 2 weeks of September. Zones 6 and 7 give you through the end of September. Zones 8 and 9 offer more flexibility, but even in warm climates, earlier planting means better root establishment and stronger plants the following spring. By mid-October in northern zones, you are gambling with the plant's survival. The odds drop sharply with every week you wait past the end of September. The soil cools faster than you expect once the nights get long, and a mum planted into cold soil simply sits there without growing new roots until it is too late. The planting depth matters as much as the timing, and getting it wrong by even an inch in either direction causes problems that show up months later. When you remove the mum from its nursery pot, look at where the stems emerge from the root mass, that junction point where the green stems meet the brown roots. That's the crown. The crown needs to sit exactly at soil level when you plant, not an inch below, not an inch above, right at the surface of the surrounding garden soil. Burying the crown too deep traps moisture against the base of the stems through fall and winter. That trapped moisture, sitting in cold, wet soil against soft plant tissue for months, creates the conditions for crown rot, a fungal infection that quietly kills the plant underground before you ever see damage above. The mum fails to emerge in spring and you assume it froze. It did not freeze, it rotted, because the crown was buried and moisture had nowhere to drain. This is one of the most common reasons gardeners who did plant their mums in September still lose them, and it is entirely preventable with correct depth. Planting too shallow does the opposite. The crown and upper roots sit exposed above the soil surface where they are directly subjected to freezing air temperatures. The very insulation benefit you gained by moving the mum out of the pot and into the ground is partially lost because the roots are not fully surrounded by soil. Soil level is the target. Set the mum in the planting hole, check that the crown junction is even with the surrounding ground. Backfill with amended garden soil and water deeply at planting to settle the soil around the roots and collapse any air pockets. Air pockets around the roots dry out the fine feeder roots and create gaps where frost can penetrate directly to the root surface. A thorough watering at planting eliminates both problems. If your garden soil is heavy clay that stays wet through winter, work some coarse compost or aged bark into the planting area to improve drainage around the crown. Mums tolerate cold very well, but they do not tolerate sitting in waterlogged soil for months. A crown that stays consistently wet through a cold winter will rot, even at the correct planting depth. Good drainage is as important as correct depth, and in clay soil, a slight raised mound of amended soil where you plant the mum keeps the crown just above the waterline during prolonged wet periods. After the first hard frost kills the foliage and turns the flowers brown, you have one more task that makes the difference between a mum that returns reliably and one that dies in a harsh winter. The winter mulch. Cut the dead stems back to about 4 to 6 inches above ground level. Do not cut them flush with the soil. Those short stubs serve a purpose through winter. They catch falling leaves and snow, which provide a layer of natural insulation directly over the crown. They also mark the location of the plant so you do not accidentally dig into it during spring garden prep. After cutting the stems, spread 3 to 4 inches of loose mulch over and around the stubbed stems. Straw works well, and so do shredded leaves and pine needles. Avoid heavy materials like wood chips or bark mulch that can pack down and trap moisture against the crown. You want an insulating layer that stays loose and allows air circulation while buffering the soil temperature underneath. If you use leaves, shred them with a mower first. Whole leaves mat together when wet and form a dense, soggy blanket that suffocates the crown rather than insulating it. Run the mower over a pile of dry leaves and the shredded pieces stay loose and fluffy all winter. The timing of mulch application matters. Do not mulch early. Wait until after the first hard frost, when the ground has started to cool and the plant has fully entered dormancy. Mulching too early in fall, while the soil is still warm and the crown is still metabolically active, traps heat and moisture against the crown and can cause the exact rot you are trying to prevent. You want the plant fully dormant and the soil surface cold before you add the insulating layer. The mulch is not there to keep the crown warm. It is there to keep the soil temperature consistent and prevent the damaging swings between freezing and thawing. This mulch layer prevents the freeze-thaw cycling that kills more mums than the cold itself. In late winter, warm sunny days thaw the surface soil and the crown begins to wake up. Then a cold night refreezes everything. The expansion and contraction of the soil during these cycles literally pushes shallow crowns upward out of the ground, a process called frost heaving. Once a crown is heaved above the soil surface, it is exposed to both freezing air and drying winter wind, and it dies within days. A mulched crown stays at a more consistent temperature, the soil around it does not cycle as violently, and the plant stays anchored where you planted it. Leave the mulch in place through winter and into early spring. When you see new green shoots pushing up through the mulch at the base of the old stubs, pull the mulch back gradually over a week or two. Give the new growth light and air, but do not strip the mulch away all at once, because a late frost can still damage tender new shoots that are suddenly exposed. That is the core system. Plant in September, get the crown at soil level, mulch after the first frost. The Flower Gardener's Bible walks through all 14 diagnoses for perennial flower problems like this. $9 at bloomrelay.co. Here is a detail that trips up gardeners who do everything right with planting and mulching and still lose their mums. The variety matters, and the tags at the garden centre are not always honest about what you are buying. Not all mums sold garden centres are bred for winter survival. Many of the mums you see stacked on pallets outside grocery stores and big box retailers are greenhouse varieties, bred specifically for maximum flower production in a 6-week display window. Cold hardiness was never part of the breeding program. These varieties produce spectacular flowers in the pot and die in the ground no matter what you do. They're bred to be disposable, and no amount of correct planting depth or winter mulch will override genetics that were never designed for outdoor survival. The varieties that come back year after year are the true garden mums, and they have names. Sheffield Pink produces apricot coral single daisy style flowers and is one of the most reliably perennial mums available in American nurseries. It blooms from October through November and spreads steadily into large, impressive clumps over the years, hardy in zones 4 through 9. Sheffield is the variety that veteran perennial gardeners recommend more than any other because it performs so consistently across different soils and climates. Clara Curtis produces clear pink single flowers on compact mounds and starts blooming in August, earlier than almost any other mum. It is extremely cold hardy, surviving in zones 3 through 9, which means it handles winters in Minnesota and Montana without any special protection beyond basic mulch. Clara Curtis is a workhorse in northern gardens where many other mums struggle. Ryan's Pink offers large double pink blooms that appear very late in the season, often still flowering after the first light frosts have knocked down other fall perennials. It extends the garden season by 2 to 3 weeks beyond where other mums stop. Mary Stoker produces soft apricot yellow single flowers with a vintage cottage garden character, hardy in zones 4 through 9. The colour is unusual for mums and pairs beautifully with the russet and burgundy tones of other fall plants. When you shop for mums this September, look at the tag before anything else. If the tag lists a variety name, that is a strong signal that the plant was bred for garden performance and winter hardiness. Named varieties have been trialed, evaluated for cold tolerance, and selected specifically because they return year after year in real garden conditions. If the tag says nothing more than formum or decorative chrysanthemum with a colour and a price, you are almost certainly looking at a greenhouse annual that will not survive its first winter regardless of how perfectly you plant it. Ask for garden hardy mums by name, or shop at independent nurseries that carry named perennial varieties rather than the anonymous mass market pots. The price is usually similar, but the plant you take home is a completely different product, bred for a completely different purpose. If you are getting value from this and you grow perennials, hit subscribe. There is a new video every week covering seasonal garden care, plant problem solving, and the kind of practical knowledge that turns expensive annual habits into permanent plantings. Now, there is something about the mums you have seen at the grocery store that explains why your garden mum will never look quite the same. And understanding this frees you from a comparison that makes gardeners feel like they are failing when they are actually succeeding. Every mum you've ever seen at a store was a perfect, symmetrical, dome-shaped sphere, absolutely covered in flowers. Tight, compact, uniform, your garden mum grows tall, loose, and floppy by comparison. Same plant, completely different appearance. And you might assume your garden growing conditions are wrong, or you are doing something incorrectly. You are not. The difference is a chemical called paclobutrazole, a growth regulator applied in commercial greenhouses during production. Paclobutrazole artificially shortens the stem internodes, the gaps between each leaf node on the stem, and forces the plant into extremely compact branching. Without the chemical, the same variety grows twice as tall with a natural, open, relaxed form. Every store mum you have ever admired was chemically dwarfed into that perfect ball shape. It is not a feature of the plant. It is a feature of the production process. Your garden mum, growing without growth regulators in real soil under real sunlight, is showing you its actual genetics for the first time. In the garden, a mature mum grows 18 to 30 inches tall, depending on the variety, with stems that arch outward and flowers that sway in the breeze along the top of the canopy. Planted in a group of 3 or 5 along a garden border, natural form mums create a loose, colourful cloud of fall flowers that weaves together with asters, goldenrod, and ornamental grasses in exactly the way a designed perennial border is supposed to look. And here is the part that experienced gardeners already know. The natural garden form, tall and loose and open with flowers dancing on flexible stems, is actually more beautiful in a perennial border than the artificial sphere. It looks like a real plant growing in real soil rather than a manufactured decoration placed on a doorstep. Stop comparing your garden mum to the greenhouse product. They share the same DNA, but they were raised in completely different environments, and the garden version is the honest one. There is one technique you can use in spring that gives your garden mums a compact, heavily branched form without any chemicals, and it takes about 30 seconds per plant. When your overwintered mum pushes new growth in spring and the stems reach about 6 inches tall, usually in mid to late May, pinch the top inch off every stem with your thumb and forefinger. This is the same Chelsea chop technique used on asters, tall phlox, and other full-blooming perennials, and it works beautifully on mums. The pinch removes the terminal bud at the tip of each stem, which is the bud that tells the stem to keep growing taller. Without that terminal bud, the stem activates dormant side buds below the pinch point, and instead of one tall stem with one flower cluster at the top, you get 3 to 4 shorter stems branching outward, each one ending in its own flower cluster by fall. If the stems are still growing vigorously after the first pinch, do a second pinch in late June. The same principle applies. Each stem tip you remove produces multiple replacement stems below it. 2 rounds of pinching can turn a single stem shoot into a dense, multi-branched framework carrying dozens of flower buds by September. The plant ends up shorter and wider than an unpinched mum, with a natural dome shape that catches light across its entire surface rather than concentrating flowers only at the top of a few tall stems. The visual difference between a pinched mum and an unpinched mum in September is striking. An unpinched plant grows tall with a handful of large flower clusters at the very top of long, bare stems. A twice-pinched plant stays compact with flowers covering the entire upper surface of the mound, and the stems are sturdy enough to hold the flower weight without flopping over after a rainstorm. Pinching gives you more flowers, better form, and stronger stems, all from 30 seconds of work in spring. Stop pinching by the 4th of July, and the reason for that specific deadline is biology, not tradition. Mums are short-day plants. They initiate flower buds when the nighttime darkness exceeds a critical threshold of roughly 12 hours of continuous dark. In the Northern Hemisphere, that threshold is crossed in late July to early August for most growing zones. The growing tips that exist on your mum on the 4th of July are the exact tips that will receive the photoperiod signal telling them to switch from leaf production to bud formation 3 to 4 weeks later. If you pinch after the 4th of July, you remove the very tips that were about to be told to flower. New replacement stems will grow from below the pinch point, but they may not have enough time to mature and set buds before the short day signal arrives, and you end up with a mum that has plenty of foliage and almost no flowers in the fall. Late May pinch, optional late June pinch. Stop by the 4th of July. That three-step schedule produces the maximum number of flower-bearing stems on a natural garden mum without any chemical intervention. The dome shape you admired at the store, you can approximate it for free with 30 seconds of pinching in spring. A mum that has been growing in the same garden spot for 3 years will start showing signs of center decline. The outer ring of the clump blooms well, the stems are vigorous, the foliage looks healthy, but the center of the clump becomes woody, bare, and produces fewer and smaller flowers than the edges. This is normal for chrysanthemums and for many other clump-forming perennials, and the fix is straightforward division. In early spring, when new shoots are 2 to 3 inches tall, dig the entire clump out of the ground. Use a sharp spade and cut a circle about 6 inches outside the visible shoot ring to get the full root mass without slicing through it. Shake or wash loose soil from the root mass so you can see the structure clearly. The healthy, actively growing sections are around the outer ring, where fresh white roots and vigorous green shoots cluster together. The woody, dead material is in the center, brown and fibrous with no active growth points. Discard the center. Separate the outer ring into divisions with 4 to 5 healthy shoots each, using a sharp spade or a heavy knife to cut through the root mass cleanly. Replant each division 18 inches apart in soil amended with a couple of inches of compost worked into the planting hole. Set each division at soil level, just as you would a new plant from the nursery. Water deeply and keep the soil consistently moist for the first few weeks while new roots establish. Each division grows into a full-sized, fully blooming plant by September of the same year. The divisions do not need a year to recover. They bloom the fall you plant them. If you want to share divisions with neighbors or friends, pot the extras in 1-gallon containers filled with potting soil. Water them well, and they will be ready to transplant into a garden bed within a few weeks. Mum divisions are one of the best plants to share because they establish quickly and bloom reliably the first season. One 3-year-old clump can supply half a neighborhood with full color. Here is the math that makes this exciting for anyone building a full garden on a budget. One 3-year-old mum produces 4 to 6 viable divisions. After another 3 years, each of those divisions produces 4 to 6 more. Starting with a single $12 garden mum purchased this September, you can populate an entire full border within 6 to 9 years without spending another dollar on mums. Every division is genetically identical to the original plant, produces the same flowers in the same color at the same time, and carries the same winter hardiness. You are not buying plants. You are multiplying them. One honest warning before you plant this September. A newly planted mum that is putting energy into establishing its root system may not produce a spectacular flower display its first fall. The blooms will be smaller and fewer than what you saw on the same plant at the garden center, because the plant is prioritizing roots over flowers in its first season in the ground. That is the right biological decision for a plant that needs to survive its first winter, and you should not judge the purchase by what it does in October. The mum knows what it needs. It is channeling sugars from its leaves downward into the root system, rather than upward into seed production, building exactly the underground infrastructure that will keep it alive through winter and fuel a strong return in April. A mum that blooms heavily its first fall after September planting actually worries experienced growers because it means the plant spent energy on flowers instead of roots, and its survival odds through a hard winter drop accordingly. By its second September, the established root system supports a full canopy of foliage and a proper flush of flowers. By its third September, the clump is bigger and more covered in blooms than any grocery store mum ever produced from a pot. The gardener who plants in September and waits through one modest first fall is rewarded with a permanent display that costs nothing after the initial purchase. The gardener who buys a new pot every October at the garden center spends $12 a year every year for a plant that dies every time. One trick: plant them in the ground in September, get the crown at soil level, water deeply, and let the roots run for 4 to 6 weeks before the freeze. Cut back after the first hard frost. Mulch 3 to 4 inches of straw or shredded leaves over the crown. Pinch the new growth in spring for twice the flowers. Divide every 3 years to expand the planting and keep the clumps vigorous. That is the system for garden mums that live 20 years instead of 6 weeks. The $12 you spend on one garden hardy variety this September is the last $12 you spend on mums for the rest of your gardening life. How many mums have you thrown away over the years? Drop the number in the comments. And if you have a garden mum that has been coming back for 5, 10, or 20 years, tell me the variety and your zone, because that information helps every gardener watching decide which one to plant this month.